All right. Thank you all so much for choosing to spend some time with us today. My name is Meg Nash. Today we'll be discussing Maryland cannabis legalization, both the implementation and upcoming opportunities that are quickly approaching. I'd like to say that we, had a crystal ball and planned into the future to schedule this the day after Governor Moore signed the legislation into law, but we got a little bit lucky in the timing here. But are very grateful that we have an opportunity to connect with everyone to discuss this exciting new market right on the heels of implementation. So you'll hear from me today, as well as my colleague Sahar and Mike Rothman. I am a partner at Vicente LLP. My practice primarily focuses on new licensing opportunities, often in competitive markets, but also in non-competitive compliance-based markets as well. I really enjoy working with entrepreneurs who are looking to get kind of their businesses set up and to really kind of help to be one of the architects and kind of charting that path forward as a project manager, and also as offering regulatory guidance in terms to ensuring that operations are both compliant and smooth, and taking into account each individual client's goals as they pursue new licensing opportunities, whether that's as a grower, a processor, a dispensary license, or other ancillary businesses. I am in the process of wading into the Maryland bar, so I'm very excited about this new jurisdiction and the way that the law has been set up, really taking into account, social equity considerations, as well as supporting businesses and their likelihood of success in the way that kind of the license caps are currently structured. We'll dig down into the nitty-gritty of that in a little bit, but just kind of wanted to give that flash forward as an exciting highlight for this market. Mike?
Thank you very much, Meg. My name is Mike Rothman. I am founder and principal of the Medical Cannabis Law Group. I'm based in Rockville, Maryland. I'm a Maryland bar member and also a DC bar member. And I've been actually doing this work and helping clients in the cannabis industry since 2012, where there wasn't even a market really in Maryland yet. Maryland's program first started in 2012, 2014, when they had a medical-based university-based system. And then flash forward to 2016, that was the first medical cannabis round. And I helped clients through the state licensing application process and assisted clients with compliance matters, following up upon what they needed to do to open their shops, both processors, growers, and dispensers. So I enjoy helping clients with regulatory and compliance matters, and I really enjoy corporate governance and helping clients get things done. That's really the important part, making sure you do so within the regulatory system. So I am based, as I said, in Rockville, Maryland, and I really look forward to these new opportunities because there's a bunch of new classes that are really going to change the way that this law works in Maryland. And there's a lot of exciting new opportunities that I think that we all could take advantage of, and we can push further and get more done this time. So thanks, Meg.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sahar. I am one of the partners at Vicente, based out of our Los Angeles office. I've been in the cannabis industry now since 2016. My specialty really in the field centers around the corporate field. So all types of corporate transactions, setting up companies, allowing them to grow, mergers and acquisitions, debt financings, ancillary agreements such as management agreements, consulting agreements, which we all know are key in various jurisdictions. Also work on licensing agreements, just about anything that requires a contract, I would say. And I also chair the firm's banking group to really help with the continuing pain point that is access to banking services, financial institutions, cash alternative methods, as well as finding financing from institutional capital.
Thank you very much, Sahar. What we were talking about before was how we got to this point in Maryland, and I was just going to go through a little bit of how the program worked before and what changes are happening now. So if you remember back in 2016, we had a medical cannabis program, which was very different than the one that is being proposed now, which is adult recreational use licenses. So under the licenses that were awarded in 2016, there were processors, growers, and dispensers. There was 102 that were approved to be distributed, but as of yet, only 97 medical dispensaries are now open. There was 18 growers and 21 processors. And right now, the program was regulated by the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, which is actually going to change under the new program, which is going to present a bunch of new challenges and opportunities. The whole new program is going to be overseen by the Maryland Cannabis, actually the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission. And there's going to be a new Cannabis Commission that's going to be overseeing the licenses, going to be overseeing the application process, and then taking forward, going to be overseeing the regulatory process also. So there's going to be significant amount of changes that's going to be happening in this program in a very short amount of time, which we're going to discuss later on. And there's a very compressed timeline that's going to happen. So we all are going to be working pretty hard to make sure that everybody's kept up to date. And also the new changes, the new regulatory changes that are happening as this new organization comes online will be pretty important too. So next slide. So the adult use program that we're talking about now differs significantly from the medical cannabis program that existed in 2016 previously. So Maryland actually became the 20th state to legalize adult use cannabis. And as you remember, if you voted or a Maryland resident, referendum 4 on the November 8th, 2022 ballot, voters in Maryland overwhelmingly voted in favor of becoming the 20th state to legalize adult use cannabis. And the Maryland General Assembly passed it. And as Meg pointed out yesterday, fortunately, we got to do this webinar on the day after Governor Wes Moore signed into law the new adult use cannabis regulatory regime and the laws. So right now we're about to start race to the finish line to get the new Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission formed. The adult use industry will be regulated by the Maryland Cannabis Administration, which would be an independent state government administration within the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Cannabis Commission. So this new entity, the Maryland Cannabis Administration, is going to be forming and performing the roles that previously the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission fulfilled. And the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission is going to go away and be subsumed into this new unit. There's also going to be an Office of Social Equity that functions within the administration that's going to shape participation in the industry by people from communities that have been previously displaced or impacted by the war on drugs. And also there's an advisory board on medical and adult use cannabis that provides recommendations to the commission and administration on guidelines, rules, and regulations. So these new boards are going to function to make sure that the new regulatory regime, which includes the social equity component, is functioning as it should be and giving opportunities to people that were previously disadvantaged and unable to take advantage of the licenses that are now currently being offered. Next slide, please. So the timeline, this is pretty important for implementation of the adult use legislation. So as we mentioned before, the legislation itself contains some very tight deadlines. So as you can see on the slide, on or before July 1st, 2023, the currently existing medical licensees, who are the growers, the processors, and the dispensers, will be able to convert over their licenses from medical to adult use on or before July 1, 2023. So that's the first time that people are going to be able to go into stores and take advantage of the opportunity to purchase from stores in adult use context rather than medical. Then later on, in the legislation itself, it talks about how the first licensing round is going to be awarded on or before January 1st, 2024, which is right around the corner, which means that if you back up the timeline, we probably expect that there's going to be a round, it's going to open probably sometime in September, and you'll have 30 days or more to fill out those applications. And then the award will be on or before January 1st, 2024. And then that's the first round. And then, as we'll discuss later, there's also a second licensing round, which is going to have to be awarded by May 1st, 2024. And that second round, we're going to talk about a little bit later, about how one can participate in the second round and the first round, each of which will have its own individual components, each of which will operate on a lottery system, which we will discuss, and each of which will have its own criteria and specially tailored application, which will be important to pay attention to the guidelines that are available for each of those individual license categories. So, it's important that we talk about which types of opportunities you qualify for, a group may qualify for. There's a bunch of new categories that are that may suit smaller individual micro processors, micro growers, and there's also a whole new class of individuals that can form both the transportation and the licensees are going to be able to perform in any of those categories, and you can put in no more than 2 applications per type of license, and we can discuss more about that later on. Next slide, please. So what's important to know that the MMCC staff, the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission staff, is going to transition over to the administration, as we discussed, to provide operations for businesses and patients in the medical section. And then new regulations governing health, safety, and security are going to be supplemental to the existing medical cannabis program regulations. So simultaneously, there's going to be medical, which will still be available, but then adult use will also become a new category. So these businesses that are now opening and functioning, which are going to be converting over to adult use, are also going to have, at the same time, a medical component. So medical is not going to go away. It's just going to become part of the business that's offered by the existing licensees right now. So these new regulations are not going to negatively impact patients that are already being served by these by the medical regime. are actually going to have their own set of rules and are going to be different than the adult use. So it's important to know that medical is not going away, and it's going to just provide additional opportunities for people to not only serve new patients and old patients, but also bring along the adult use marketplace. Specifically, patient-only operating, the new laws that are being proposed now specifically establish patient-only operating hours, product availability, and other accommodations to ensure that registered patients will continue to be able to access necessary medication. What this means is there are going to be most likely different categories, different products that may be offered through the medical aspect of these existing businesses. So the growers, the processors, the dispensers are going to be able to offer medical cannabis in specific quantities or specific dosages that won't necessarily be available to the adult use market. So that will just help to not only refine the amount of and the types of products that can be offered, it will also enhance the ability of the adult use marketplace to segregate and capture the clientele they're aiming for. So it'll, go ahead.
Sorry, excuse me, Mike. I just wanted to put one kind of point of clarification on the patient-only operating hours. In the final legislation, it will allow dispensaries, all of which will be both medical and adult use, to provide patient-only operating hours or separate service lines. So there's a kind of bit of a business decision there as to, what licensees prefer to do. I anticipate that most licensees will opt to provide separate service lines as opposed to separate operating hours, just based on prior jurisdictions and how that conversion has looked. And it seems like, that was sort of an intentional change in the legislation to just kind of create another manner of which to ensure that patient access remains without having to have a specific carve out. But again, a bit of a business decision there. Just wanted to flag it while we were on this slide.
Thanks. So, as we discussed before, existing licensees will be allowed to convert their operations to medical and adult use activities on or before July 1st, 2023. So that's obviously coming up very quickly, and that's going to change significantly the way that the businesses that are now in effect operate. And as Meg pointed out, there's going to be new business opportunities to expand to the adult use marketplace while maintaining the clientele that's become the medical market. And we don't anticipate that the medical market will change, because the people that need their medication will continue to require special advice, special treatment, and special products that may not be offered in the adult use marketplace. In addition, as we discussed or will discuss, there's conversion fees that these processors, growers, and dispensers are going to have to be paying in order to convert over to the adult use marketplace. And that's going to be a sliding scale based on the revenue that was taken in over the last couple of years. And so they're going to pay relatively different amounts depending upon what their prior revenue was. So cultivators, processors, for example, would be paying 10% roughly of the 2022 revenue, and dispensaries would be paying 8% of 2022 revenue, which depending upon where those businesses were located could vary significantly depending upon traffic. So that's something that we're going to have to monitor closely too. If you already have a license and need to convert over to the new adult use marketplace, it's going to be making sure that you budget for the that change in conversion, that conversion rate that is going to make the new business expensive in some ways, but you ought to be able to capture the revenue in a different way too, given the additional clientele that's going to be visiting the stores, processors, or growers, or the dispensers, or any of the new categories that are now being created. So as we will discuss later on, there's going to be a tremendous amount of opportunity that is going to be available. Next slide, please. So as we were talking about before, there's the standard licenses. There's some new categories that are going to be available for adult use that were not available previously for medical. The standard licenses, as you see on the left-hand side, this authorizes growers to have between 10,000 and 300,000 square feet of indoor canopy, and for processors to process more than 1,000 pounds of cannabis per year, and dispensaries are permitted to operate a store at a physical location that sells cannabis or cannabis products. Now, here's the new twist that are going to be offering some significant opportunities for people who are smaller and may not need or want to carry the inventory that was necessary for a dispenser. There's going to be these micro licenses that authorize growers to have no more than 10,000 square feet of indoor canopy, and for processors to process no more than 1,000 pounds of cannabis per year. And dispensaries are permitted to operate a delivery service that sells cannabis or cannabis products without a physical storefront, provided that the licensee does not employ more than 10 employees. What's important to note that these micro licenses are going to make up, depending upon the categories, are going to make up a fair amount of new licensees that are going to be able to take advantage of this new law under the new adult use regulatory regime. So the micro licenses are going to offer an opportunity that wasn't previously available. Smaller businesses are going to be able to compete, and they're going to be able to not necessarily have a storefront. They're going to be able to process less. They're going to be able to grow in a smaller space, which is going to allow groups, individuals to participate in ways that they previously couldn't, based on the size limitation and the amount of people that needed to be served under the medical program. We also are talking about the incubator space licenses. This type of license authorizes the licensee to operate a facility within which a micro licensee may operate. So these incubator spaces will offer opportunities to have a micro licensee take part in part of the business that is, as you'll see soon, there's a number of licenses that will be available, but these incubator spaces, there's not as many as micro licensees are going to be available. So what we have are going to be groups. As you'll see from the chart coming up, you'll see how many are going to be available in each category. And that's what we have here. You can see the total number of licenses to be awarded on the left-hand column. And you can see the max licenses issued on the first round, and then the max licenses issued on the second round. So the first round, the total number of licenses to be awarded as a grower is going to be 75 total. And then on the first round, they're going to be offering 20. And then the second round, a max of 20 also. That's in addition to the ones that have converted over now from medical to adult use. So it's going to be important for us to budget and to make sure that which categories and rounds you're able to compete in. The more rounds that you can compete in, the greater your chances of winning. Although there is a lottery, which certainly makes it statistically more of a random event, but you can put in more applications depending upon how you structure the opportunities and how you structure the groups that you're putting together. So the licensees, the micro licensees, as we discussed before, under the grower option, offer 100 licenses, 30 to be issued in the first round, and then 30 to be issued, 75 to be issued the second round. So there's going to be greater opportunities. This category, micro licensees for growers, is one that's going to be expanding and didn't exist before. So this is going to give everybody an opportunity to compete for these licenses that didn't previously exist before and are going to be more competitive and also not require as much capital. With regard to the processors, there's going to be 100 available, 40 to be issued in the first round and 25 to be issued in the second round. The ones that are converting over from medical to adult use are going to make up the remainder. And then again, a micro licensee category of processors, which is being created anew and is going to offer significant opportunities for individuals and groups that are not going to require the capital and the investment that the original processors did during the first round back in 2016. So these are exciting new opportunities for us all to consider, given the reduced size, given the reduced capital requirements, and given the lower production amounts. And then finally, the dispensaries, there's going to be 300 to be awarded altogether, 80 during the first round, 120 during the second round, and the remainder, obviously, the 97 are going to be converting over from from medical use to adult use, and that's going to make up the bulk of the dispensaries. But there's also going to be a delivery option and a micro license option in the dispensaries. While there's going to be not as many slots available in those categories, 10, as you can see, for delivery during the first and second round, and then the micro licenses for dispensaries would be 10 and then none the second round. So the dispensaries are going to offer another opportunity for micro licensees and delivery options that were available in a limited or non-existent capacity. So for delivery was available before, but not how they're restructuring it now. And then the micro license will be available. And this is a category that's being created brand new out of what has become the new legislation. So this is going to be a category that's going to be expanded, although there aren't as many slots as in the processor category or the grower category. Nonetheless, it's going to offer a very good opportunity for individuals to take advantage of these different categories that require less capital investment and less people, but also allow smaller companies and groups to participate in this new marketplace. So next slide.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
It's helpful to kind of have some background as to where we've been while we think about where we're going. So as Mike described, there's going to be these new licensing categories as we look ahead to these future licensing rounds. The legislation specifically calls out 2 specific licensing rounds that we included on our timeline. The first round will open in September of 2023 and will be limited to social equity applicants. And the second round is expected right around May of 2024. And then any future rounds are only going to be based on market demand. So suffice to say, if you're interested in obtaining a cannabis license in Maryland, it's imperative that you apply during one or both of these future rounds, because any future opportunities will really be dependent on kind of market demand and the evolution of the market, as where there's kind of these guaranteed openings coming up in the near future. And while, you know, September can seem a bit far away at this point, I anticipate that things will start to move very quickly. Even since the law was signed, you know, yesterday, the MMCC website has already changed to the MCA website. They have a new logo up this morning, a lot of the same content, but there really seems to be a good, you know, sense of urgency to get this program implemented, which I think will really just further kind of its success in this market. So turning specifically to the first round of licensing and what we expect to see there. This specific round has been carved out for what is defined as social equity applicants, which is defined as an applicant that has at least 65% ownership and control held by one or more individuals who have lived in a disproportionately impacted area for at least 5 of the last 10 years, attended a public school in a disproportionate impact area, or for at least 2 years attended a 4-year institution of higher education in Maryland, where the individuals, where there's a percentage of individuals eligible to receive a Pell Grant. And we may see additional criteria in the emergency regulations, but we know this now to kind of start planning ahead for this future licensing round. The disproportionate impact area is defined as a geographic area that will be identified by the Office of Social Equity that has had above 150% of average for cannabis possession charges. So we are waiting for this map to be released by the Office of Social Equity. It's not clear as to when that information will be released. But if the kind of swiftness that we're already seeing, again, kind of the flip of the website overnight is any indication, I think that there will be, you know, hopefully sooner, you know, like we'd see it more closer to July as adult use is implemented, as opposed to August, you know, which should just be a little bit before the release of the applications in September. So in the first round of licensing, kind of going back to that chart, there's 20 grower, 40 processor, 80 dispensary licenses. Those are standard licenses with larger canopy processing and storefront limitations. The micro licenses, there's 30 grower, 30 processor, 10 dispensary licenses, and 10 incubator licenses. If we go just to the next slide, we'll see that the application will include an application fee. So for micro licenses, that's a $1,000 application fee. And for standard licenses, that's a $5,000 application fee. And we expect a form to be released by the MCA, the Maryland Cannabis Administration, that's going to require applicants to submit an operational plan, a business plan, a detailed diversity plan, as well as evidence that the applicant qualifies as a social equity applicant. We don't have that specific criteria spelled out in the legislation. We anticipate that it will be in the emergency regulations. But what we have seen in other jurisdictions, in New York or Connecticut, for example, when there have been kind of a specific class of licenses carved out, typically agencies want to see, you know, tax records or school records or utility bills or something like that to kind of demonstrate the prior residency, demonstrate the attendance at a public school in a DIA, to demonstrate the qualifications of satisfying a, you know, the social equity criteria, as well as a compliant operating agreement or other corporate documentation, which Sahar will touch upon, to demonstrate that ownership and control. And that can be, you know, something that you would typically need assistance in drafting. I know that there will be a lot of kind of outreach with respect to trying on behalf of the MCA to assist individuals and entities in getting applications submitted and providing guidance, but those corporate components can be, unique in order to kind of satisfy the regulatory requirements. As Mike mentioned, this will be a lottery. However, applicants can only submit a total of 2 applications, and they cannot be for the same license. So if you want a dispensary license, you could submit an application for a standard dispensary license or a micro license, and that would get you kind of in the running for a type of dispensing license, or you could submit 1 grower application, 1 processor application, but not 2. And I think that the policy initiative behind this and what we're seeing kind of overall from kind of a high level overview is that the legislature is really trying to reduce barriers to entry. I think that that's kind of proof or evidenced by the fact of the lower application fees of $1,000 or $5,000. And they also don't want to see, by kind of limiting the number of applications that entities and applicants can submit, they don't want to see people kind of pay to play or stuff the ballot box, if you will. So I think that there's really been a lot of intentional level setting with how this program rolls out. And I think that that's admirable in its intention, and we'll see how it kind of transpires as we move through the licensing process. So now that we know a little bit about when the licensing applications will be available and what they will contain, what happens next? Once they're submitted to the Cannabis Administration, they will be reviewed on a pass-fail basis and then entered into a lottery. So in terms of submitting a lottery compliant application, it's imperative that each application has fully compliant narratives that take into account the regulations, demonstrate a comprehension of the way that a cannabis business runs. And I think I saw one of the questions previously, would each license be both medical and adult use? And the answer to that is yes. All licenses in Maryland are intended to serve both the adult use and patient population. So I also anticipate that, incorporating components of kind of one-on-one patient consultations, taking a bit more of a medical approach in all aspects as opposed to just a purely adult use approach will be important in terms of kind of narrative drafting and application preparation. Just kind of food for thought. In between October and November of 2023, after those applications have been graded, or I'm sorry, during that period, the applications will be graded to kind of create the lottery pool. And then on or about January 1st, 2024, the first round of licensees will be notified if they won. So that will be a first and very exciting hurdle to get this program underway. Again, kind of going to the policy considerations that make up the backbone of this legislation, it's clear that the legislatures wanted to take a very intentional approach to ensuring that this was an inclusive industry. And so as part of that, what we expect to see prior to the second round of licensing is that there is going to be a disparity study conducted focusing on who won in the first round. So essentially, the MCA, in consultation with a number of different Maryland government agencies, is going to take a look at the pool of applicants, at the pool of awardees, to determine whether or not they're succeeding in making this an inclusive industry in terms of diverse representation of licensees. To the extent that the disparity study reveals that the licensing process has fallen short of those goals, we expect to see different components in the second licensing round, such as proactive remedial measures, or perhaps prioritization of minority-owned businesses, or other, limiting it to social equity applicants. Again, I have to say that even for myself reading the legislation, there's a bit of confusion as to what exactly this is going to look like with respect to the disparity study. So there's a little bit more variable as to what this is going to look like until we get through the first round. But we do know for certain that all micro licenses in the second round will be limited to social equity applicants as well. And the good thing about that is that if you've applied during the first round and you are not awarded a license, you should have an application ready to submit in the second round as a social equity applicant for a micro license. Again, where there's kind of an element of chance here with the lottery award system, I do think that there's just some logic to applying often in both the first and second round, particularly if the work has already been put in upfront. So during the second round, there'll be additional licenses awarded, 25 grower, 25 processor, 120 dispensary licenses for standard licenses, and then 70 grower, 70 processor licenses for micro licenses. We're also going to see incubator space licenses and then these on-site consumption licenses. The on-site consumption license is, essentially a smoking lounge, although it does limit kind of smoking to outdoor spaces. And obviously, kind of with climate considerations and how enjoyable that experience might be in Maryland, we'll kind of have to wait and see how the on-site consumption licenses are implemented and the business plan and strategy there. But again, another great opportunity for a new license type that we haven't seen in Maryland before. Similar to the first round of licensing, the applications in the second round will be reviewed on a pass-fail basis and entered into a lottery. We'll see, that same review process, and then the applications, the date there is wrong for the January 2024 notification because it'll start in May. But then we can probably predict kind of that same turnaround where we'll see licenses awarded in August or September of 2024. And once the license is awarded, there is an application fee for license of $50,000. So while it does kind of create these lower barriers to entry, you do have to have the capital to get up and running, not only for the license fee, but then to have property as well, and kind of get all of your operations up and running. Property is not a requirement for the application process, which again kind of speaks to the intentionality on creating lower barriers to entry for folks that are interested in the cannabis industry in Maryland. A lot of other states you see where property is required, and that in and of itself can, be dispositive in kind of charting a path forward. So again, I kind of applaud the Maryland legislation and the manner of which they've set this up in terms of creating opportunities, but no matter what, it will end up being a capital intensive process. Whether it's, even if it's not sooner, it'll be later. As we mentioned kind of at the top of the hour, any future licensing rounds will be dependent on market demand. And then the way that is kind of structured, whether it's limited to social equity applicants again, or, other types of remedial measures to ensure kind of participation of minority businesses will remain to be seen. And I don't expect to know sort of more about what that will look like until not only we get through the first and second round, but also likely to see these businesses that are licensed get operational, which can have its own relative lead time. We'll have to wait and see if the emergency regulations, which are expected before July 1, provide any further clarity on these kind of details, because typically you get that in the regulations as opposed to the statutory law. But nonetheless, very exciting times to have these new licensing opportunities right around the horizon. I'll let Sahar kind of pick up from here on corporate considerations.
Thanks, Meg. So now that we have gone through the legislative specifics of what the various application rounds will look like, what timelines will look like, we'll take a closer look at getting prepared for submitting an application specifically from the corporate side of things. So one of the first things to think about when putting together a potential applicant entity is what type of entity that applicant will be. And this really boils down largely to whether you're going to have your entity an LLC or a corporation. One of the first things that we want to think about in making that decision are the tax considerations. So some of the benefits, some of the protections, as well as some of what may be viewed as cons for having an LLC versus a corporation. It's really important at this point to speak with both an attorney that specializes in the corporate realm, as well as speaking with a tax advisor, letting them know what your goals are and what you hope to accomplish and glean from your entity. Also important to think about the type of governance that you want to have, having a larger group, having more, quiet on the side investors versus having a larger number of folks that really want to be active participants in the day-to-day operations of the business. Another consideration when forming your entity and your entity type, and how that's going to work in the present day as well as evolve. Now, as has been discussed multiple times, ownership for round one must reflect the social equity ownership requirements. Again, that's that 65%. That 65% translates both to ownership. So the cap table that you have, let's say you have an LLC, your LLC's units, 65% of them must be held by a social equity owner, as well as control. Now we're going to get into control in the next slide, but it's important that the corporate governance documents that the entity has reflect both the control aspect as well as the ownership aspect, because a reading of the regulations, reading of the law will show that if you just have social equity ownership with respect to equity for 65%, but the control in the governance documents is not also inclusive of that 65%, you may run into an issue and not be able to go forward into the lottery. So in this next slide that we're about to get into, we're going to look at entity formation with respect to the control aspects. Now, one of the key things about Maryland's laws from a corporate perspective is the definition of control and the breakdown of what includes control. In a lot of other states, we will have regulators specify control as something that creates, say ownership, will necessitate background checks and whatnot, but control is not as clearly spelled out. Maryland's regulations do specify what control is and provide different instances of what control may be. So control is currently defined as decision-making authority over the management, operations, or policies that guide a business, or authority over the operations of the technical aspects of the business. Broad, so we're going to get into some of the examples that have been provided in the law. This is holding a right to veto significant events, meaning that if one of the members, let's say, of an LLC can have an absolute veto on the sale business, on businesses, line of business, or significant events, that significant events are not specified. So the way that the corporate governance documents of an entity are formed may, inform how that entity views significant events. So something to really think about. Another example of control is the right or authority to make or veto decisions regarding operations and strategic planning, capital allocations, acquisitions, and divestment. Feeds into the top a little bit, again, with the veto piece. What this really means is a person or a member, let's say, or shareholder who can decide where the money in the business goes in a significant way, what the business or the entity can take in or acquire, what part of itself the business or the entity can sell off. So these, again, are really high-level important decisions that if shareholder or member is seen as having, they are seen as having control in accordance with Maryland's definition of control. Another example is the ability to appoint, remove direction, or appoint or remove directions, corporate level officers, or their equivalents. So if someone, say a member or a shareholder, is able to appoint a manager for an LLC, appoint a board, let's say, or appoint someone who will have direction over the business, that also going to be seen as control. The ability to make major financial decisions feeds in again to the idea of the person who really pulls the purse strings of the entity being seen as someone who controls. The market piece going to the idea that a person, a member, shareholder who can make decisions as to how the entity is held out to the public. Marketing is also seen as having significant control. And then the last example that's been provided to us in the laws is the ability to execute exclusive contracts or significant contracts in the aggregate of $10,000 or greater on behalf of the licensee. So if a person, again, manager, shareholder, member, is able to sign a contract that is exclusive and exclusively binds the company, or a contract or a series of contracts in aggregate that are $10,000 and above, that person will be seen as having control. Again, someone who is able to perform any of the duties that we've talked about or have any kind of that decision making, anyone who has this will be seen as control. And 65% of the control, not just the ownership, but also the control of an applicant entity must be with a social equity member, social equity shareholder for this first round of licensing. So on the next slide that we're going to get into, we're going to think about raising capital. Of course, having a cannabis operation can be expensive, both to get it started as well as to continue it going. The laws that have just been signed in by the governor do specify various application fees, but also it's important to keep in mind that putting together an applicant entity, putting together an application, depending on the complication of it, depending on how in-depth the contracts around it, the governing documents around it go, can become more or less costly. So important to think about raising capital from the beginning, really. One of the first considerations to think about when going into the capital raise portion is how you will raise capital, whether that will be through equity or whether that will be through debt. Equity obviously meaning that you will be selling a portion of your entity in return for funds, and the buyer then becomes a partner of yours. They hold interest in your entity. Debt meaning that you take on a loan, you pay it back. Usually you're done with, your lender, unless of course it's debt that converts into equity. Really good way to think about these two key possibilities is that, equity is like marriage and debt is like dating. So that should be reversed actually. Also important to think about, again, the social equity thresholds when thinking about taking on equity or convertible debt, because that 65%, again, must be there for you to be able to get into the lottery for the first round. And so you don't want to end up selling off more equity or giving convertible debt that would then make it so that the social equity partner no longer holds at least 65% of the business. The investment documents, irrespective of the investment type that you're taking in, must be very closely tailored with the regulatory and legal requirements in mind with respect to the cannabis code. So again, if you are taking on an equity or a debt investment, be really careful that you are not giving too much control to another, whether that's something that's going to create an issue for the 65% interested in that first round. Also important to think about the ancillary documents that come into an investment. So an investor may come in and, want to do an equity investment, but they may also want to become a service provider to the entity in addition to that equity investment, or they may want to bring in a debt investment and also provide certain consulting services to the entity. Important to think about how the entirety of the documents, including both the equity and debt documents, as well as ancillary documents, are going to play out in the day-to-day operations, whether some or all of the documents will be subject to regulatory disclosure, and whether or not they would pass muster. So on the next slide that we're going to be going into, we're just going to think about how the various different regulatory limits that have been implemented may play into investment types. So if, for example, an investor wants to be a passive investor, 5% or below, without really significant control, that will open the door for them to be able to go into more entities, whereas active investors, again, will be limited by the various regulatory limits with respect to participation in a multitude of different entities. When taking on an investor, it's important to think about this. It's important to ask your investor, especially if they're going to be more than just a passive investor, who else they have invested with, who else they may be investing with, the type of control that they'll think about having both in your entity as well as other potential applicants and operators, and think about whether or not that's going to create an issue with respect to the limits. Something to also think about is investors, especially those who will not be passive investors, may be subject to background checks. So if you are taking on an investor that is newer to the cannabis industry and feeling a little bit iffy and uncomfortable about background checks, you definitely want to make this clear to them up front. You don't want to go down figuring out all the different various ways that you want your deal to shake out, only for it to fall through because the investor doesn't want to go through background checks. I think we have a couple minutes left, and we're going to go into summaries and Q&A.
Thanks, Sahar. We kind of put up this slide to kind of frame some questions that we anticipated, but I'll go right to the Q&A chat so that hopefully we can be more direct in our responses. I saw the first question: are there going to be any set-aside licenses or priority application policies for veterans? The legislation does contemplate that the administration will make kind of proactive outreach to MBEs or VOBs in anticipation of licensing rounds. But so far, what we're seeing in the statutory language is really limited to the social equity applicant language. Again, kind of depending on what that disparity study reveals after the first round of licensing, that may become a component in the second round of licensing, but we're doing a bit of a tea leaf reading at this point without emergency regulations and without the disparity study. With respect to the timing of the emergency regulations, we're cautiously optimistic that we're going to see them in the next week or two, at least for initial publication, in order to kind of satisfy the timeline of getting them out before July 1. We've also been hearing that MMCC has been proactively working on this, I'm sure before the kind of April 8th passage in the legislature and before the governor's signing, to sort of streamline this. It does seem, again, like there's a lot of incentive to get this program up and running, and a lot of motivation to really do it well. And I think that prioritizing getting guidance out sooner rather than later is just another component of that. With the question, will product regulations be different or will it be the same for medical and adult? Everything we've seen in the legislation is that the new regs will be supplemental to existing regulations and that they should be consistent as much as possible. again, where each license is going to allow both medical and adult use operations, there's logic to making sure that this is kind of a bit more of a streamlined process, and that there's not wildly different kind of packaging considerations for adult use versus medical, or product limitations for medical or adult use, although we may see some differential there, just based on the need. So likely to be some differences, but the goal has certainly been clearly articulated to keep this, as uniform as possible, to assist not only kind of existing operators, but also provide further clarity as the MCA gets up and running, to rely on some of the guidance that's previously been published by MMCC. I think that we've touched on a lot of these other questions. There won't be property requirements for the initial submission. There isn't a lot of clarification as to kind of the geographic diversity or dispersion of licensees in Maryland just yet. It may be a component of the emergency regulations. Our team is certainly tracking everything very closely. We'll be continuing to, blog and publish on developments in Maryland, and are hoping to host another webinar in July once the program is up and running and we have even further insight from MCA. But overall, incredibly exciting times in this jurisdiction. If anyone has any kind of further questions, or if our team can be of assistance, please feel free to reach out directly. Our contact information is up on the slide, and we would be happy to discuss this more with you. We're very involved no matter what. So hope that we can, have an opportunity to discuss this more with anyone who's interested.
Thanks, everyone.